had always thought I knew him, but in that moment, as I stood frozen in the doorway of our bedroom, I realized just how wrong I was. Mark was lying there in our bed with Sarah, my best friend, his hand resting on her bare skin as if it belonged there. The soft glow of the bedside lamp cast a warm, intimate light on them, making the scene seem almost surreal. The hum of the air conditioner was the only sound in the room, and for a moment everything felt muffled, as though the world had paused. I could barely breathe. I was standing there, my eyes wide, unable to process what I was seeing. They didn't notice me at first. Mark, with his eyes closed, his face relaxed, and Sarah, who had always been so close to me, was now in his arms. I stood there, unable to speak, as time seemed to stretch on forever. Then, as if sensing my presence, Mark's eyes flicked open, and for the briefest second, he froze, his body stiffening. His lips parted, but no words came out. Sarah turned toward me, her eyes wide with surprise, but there was no hint of shame, no apology. She simply looked at me as though I were the intruder. And then she smiled, a smile that was so cold, so calculated, that it sent a shiver down my spine. My heart didn't break. It froze like a lake in the dead of winter. The kind of freeze that comes before everything shatters. In that moment I wasn't angry, not yet. I wasn't even sad. I just felt clarity. I didn't scream, didn't storm out. I didn't do anything dramatic. Instead, I turned on my heel, walked out of the room, and closed the door behind me. I didn't have to say anything. Everything I needed to know was in that single frozen moment. I went to the kitchen, took a deep breath, and started thinking. I needed a plan. I wasn't going to let this go. Not after everything I had built with him. Not after all the years I had sacrificed. I had worked so hard to make our life together, and now this. My hands trembled as I picked up my phone. I called the one person I knew I could trust right now, my lawyer. I didn't need to tell him everything just yet. But I knew that what I had just witnessed was the beginning of something much bigger. I needed to act, and I needed to act fast. I wasn't going to be a victim of his lies. Not again. And I wasn't going to let Sarah get away with it either. This wasn't just an affair. This was something much more calculated, much more dangerous. And I was going to be the one to take control. I sat at the kitchen table, my fingers nervously tapping on the cold surface. My mind raced, each thought more frantic than the last. I couldn't believe what had just happened, what I had seen. It wasn't just about the betrayal. It was the way they had done it so openly, without a shred of guilt. Mark, my husband for nearly 15 years, and Sarah, my best friend, were in our bed together. The thought made my stomach twist in knots. But there was something else, something darker in that moment. I had seen the look in Mark's eyes when he saw me standing there. It wasn't fear. It wasn't regret. It was relief. Like he had been waiting for this moment, knowing it was inevitable. I had always trusted him, and I had trusted Sarah. That trust was shattered in an instant. As I sat there, my mind kept replaying the events over and over again. It was as if my body was an autopilot, moving through the motions while my thoughts spun out of control. I stood up abruptly, walking to the living room where my laptop sat on the coffee table. I opened it slowly, the weight of what I was about to do hanging heavy in the air. I had already made up my mind. This wasn't just about them sleeping together. This was about everything Mark had hidden from me over the years. The secrets. The lies. The business deals that never made sense, the money that had gone missing. I had always been the supportive wife, always there for him, handling the household, the kids, and even the business when he needed me. But now, I understood that everything I had done had been a facade, a distraction for the things he really cared about. I opened up a file on my computer. It was a contract, a document that I had glanced at months ago but never thought much of. At the time it seemed irrelevant, just another piece of paperwork in the long list of things that came with being married to Mark. But now I knew it was something more. I knew he had been using that contract to secure his future, his wealth, while leaving me out in the cold. The signature on the document wasn't just a formality, it was the key to everything. I had been too trusting, too blind to see the warning signs before. But now, with everything out in the open, I had a choice. I wasn't going to let him get away with this. I wasn't going to let Sarah walk away without facing the consequences of what they had done. I wasn't a victim. I was going to take control of this situation, not with anger, not with a screaming match, but with something much more powerful. I clicked on the document, opened the editing software, and began to change the terms. The numbers, the clauses, the signatures, they were all about to be altered. I wasn't just changing the document. I was changing the power dynamic between us. I wasn't going to be the one left holding the broken pieces of a marriage. I was going to walk away with everything I deserved. When I finished, I saved the document, closed my laptop, and took a deep breath. I stood up and looked around the room. Everything in my life had just shifted. There was no turning back now. As I walked out of the living room and back toward the bedroom, I couldn't help but feel a strange sense of calm. The chaos inside me had settled. I had a plan. And for the first time in years, I wasn't afraid of what came next. I woke up the next morning, the sunlight creeping through the blinds, casting soft shadows across the room. My mind was still racing from everything that had happened the night before. It was as though the events had unfolded in a blur. And yet the clarity I had felt when I made my decision to take control was still with me. I stood up, feeling the cool air against my skin as I stretched. My eyes fell on the phone next to my bed, and for a moment I hesitated. I knew what I had to do next, but I didn't know how. He would react. Mark would never expect this. He would think I was just going to let it slide. He would think I was still the same person, the one who would stand by him no matter what. But I wasn't that person anymore. I had already changed the document. Now it was time to put my plan into action. I walked into the kitchen, the scent of coffee filling the air. The kitchen felt different this morning. It wasn't just the usual routine of making breakfast and preparing for another day. This morning everything felt deliberate, controlled. As I poured myself a cup of coffee, I thought about how Mark had always taken the lead. He always made the decisions, always thought he was in control. But now I was the one pulling the strings. The thought gave me a strange sense of power. I wasn't just a wife anymore. I wasn't just someone who cleaned up the messes and kept everything running smoothly. I was taking back my life. I sat down at the table, taking a deep breath. I had been through so much with Mark. I had supported him through everything, from building his career to raising our children. And now this was how he repaid me. By betraying me with Sarah? No. I wasn't going to be the one to suffer in silence any longer. I had already made up my mind. The phone buzzed on the table, pulling me from my thoughts. It was a message from Mark. "I'll be home by 6, he wrote. "We need to talk." I stared at the screen for a moment, wondering what he was thinking. He probably thought everything would go back to normal once he explained himself. But I wasn't going to let that happen. I wasn't going to listen to his excuses, his empty apologies. He had made his choices, and now it was my turn to make mine. I took another sip of coffee, savoring the bitterness. I had a long day ahead of me. The document I had changed wasn't just a piece of paper. It was the beginning of my new life. It was the end of everything I had known. And when Mark walked through that door later, thinking he could fix things with a few words, he would find out just how wrong he was. I stood up, feeling the weight of the decision settling in. It was time. I had a meeting scheduled for later in the afternoon, a meeting that would change everything. This was no longer about revenge. It wasn't even about Mark or Sarah anymore. It was about me, about taking back what was rightfully mine. The clock ticked on the wall, the minutes slipping away as I prepared for the moment that would define the rest of my life. I watched the clock tick down the hours, the minute hand moving as steadily as my pulse, each second stretching into what felt like eternity. The house was unusually quiet, almost too quiet. The kids were at school and Mark was still at work, or so he said. I knew better now than to take him at his word. I had already made arrangements. Today wasn't going to be about playing the role of the dutiful wife anymore. Today was about taking control. I walked around the house, taking in the familiar surroundings. The polished wood floors, the soft beige walls, the family pictures that had once represented the life I had worked so hard to build. I had spent so many years making this house a home, but now it was just a shell of what it used to be. Everything had changed in a matter of days. I stopped in front of the living room window, looking out at the street. The familiar view didn't bring me any comfort anymore. I thought about Mark, his calm demeanor when he thought I wouldn't find out. He had always believed he was invincible, that I would never question him. But now I saw him for who he truly was. He thought he could have it all, me, Sarah, his career, and that I would just sit back and accept it. Not anymore. The doorbell rang, pulling me from my thoughts. I glanced at the clock. It was nearly 3 p.m. Mark wouldn't be home for another 3 hours. I opened the door to find my lawyer standing on the other side, a briefcase in hand. He was a man of few words, but his presence was always reassuring. He stepped inside without waiting for an invitation, his eyes scanning the room as if taking in every detail. "Everything ready?" he asked, his voice steady, professional. I nodded, leading him to the living room. "Let's get this over with," I said, sitting down on the couch. He placed the briefcase on the coffee table, opened it, and pulled out the stack of documents I had signed earlier. I hadn't hesitated for a second when I made those changes. It felt right, like the only thing left to do after everything I had learned. As he went through the papers explaining each section, my mind kept drifting back to that night. The image of Mark and Sarah, so careless in their betrayal, still haunted me. But the more I thought about it, the clearer my path became. I wasn't just doing this for revenge. I was doing it for myself, to reclaim my dignity and my life. My lawyer looked up from the papers. "Are you sure you want to go through with this? It's not going to be easy. Mark is going to fight back, and you'll need to be ready for everything." I didn't answer immediately. I let the weight of his words settle in. I had thought about it long and hard. The decision wasn't an easy one, but it was the right one. "I'm ready," I said finally, my voice firm. "Let's do this." He nodded, sealing the papers back into his briefcase. "Then I'll take care of the rest." As he left, I stood at the door for a moment, watching him drive away. The reality of what I had just set in motion began to sink in. This wasn't just about fixing my marriage or catching Mark in a lie. It was about changing the course of my life, taking back the power I had handed over to him years ago. I wasn't going to be the passive victim anymore. I was going to be the one in control. I sat back down on the couch, the silence of the house pressing in on me. It was almost time for Mark to come home. And when he did, he would find a very different woman waiting for him. The door creaked as it opened, and I felt a chill run down my spine. It wasn't because of the cold air outside, but because I knew this was the moment everything would change. Mark walked in, his briefcase in hand, his face unreadable as always. He greeted me with a casual, "Hey," but I could see the tension in his shoulders, the slight furrow in his brow. He hadn't noticed anything yet. I didn't say anything right away. I just stood there, watching him as he removed his jacket and hung it up. He dropped his briefcase onto the sofa, his movements slow, deliberate. "We need to talk," he said, his voice finally breaking the silence. His words didn't have the usual confidence, the usual authority. It was almost as if he was bracing himself for something, though he didn't know what. "I know," I replied simply, my voice steady. I walked over to the table, the one where the papers were now neatly stacked. I had been prepared for this moment. I had thought about what I would say, how I would say it, but now in his presence I realized there was nothing left to say. The silence between us stretched on, the weight of the situation settling in. He walked toward me, a slight smile forming on his lips as he reached for my hand. But I pulled away, the action subtle, but enough to stop him in his tracks. The smile faded, replaced by a look of confusion. "What's going on?" he asked, his voice tinged with impatience. "What's going on is that I'm done," I said, the words finally spilling out. "I'm done being the wife who ignores the lies, who picks up the pieces after you shatter everything. I'm done." The room was still. His face froze, his eyes widening as he processed what I had just said. "What do you mean, done? We can work through this. We always do." "No," I said, shaking my head slowly. "Not this time. You've crossed the line, Mark. And this time there's no going back." He looked at me, his eyes flickering with disbelief, as if he couldn't understand how I could be so certain, so resolute. "We're married. We've been through everything together. You can't just throw that away." "I'm not throwing anything away," I replied. "I'm taking back what's mine. I've been building this life with you, believing in you, supporting you, and now I see everything for what it really is. I've been living in a lie, and I'm done with it." He stood there, silent, staring at me. I could see his mind working, trying to figure out how to regain control of the situation. "You can't be serious," he muttered, his voice low and defensive. "You don't know what you're saying. We're a family." "Not anymore," I said, cutting him off. "Not after what you did. You chose Sarah. You've been lying to me for months, maybe longer. And now I see it all. The lies, the betrayal. I'm done being the fool. I took a deep breath, watching his expression shift from disbelief to something else. Fear, maybe? It was the first time I had ever seen Mark look unsure of himself. For the first time, I felt like I had the power in this conversation, not him. You've been playing games for too long. But I'm not playing anymore, I continued. I've already taken steps to protect myself. I'm not going to let you walk away from this unscathed. You'll regret this, Mark. I promise you. His jaw tightened, and I could see the flicker of anger in his eyes, but it wasn't enough to intimidate me. I wasn't scared anymore. You think you can just change things like that? He asked, his voice rising. You think you can just walk away from everything we've built? I'm not walking away, I said, my voice steady, unwavering. I'm taking back what's mine. And you're going to have to deal with the consequences of your actions. There was a long pause, and for a moment I thought he might speak again, but instead, he just stood there silently, as if the weight of my words had finally sunk in. I felt a strange sense of satisfaction, but also a deep sense of finality. This was it. There was no turning back. I wasn't just ending our marriage. I was ending the version of myself that had been living in the shadow of his lies. This was the new me, the one who took control, who refused to be a victim anymore. And as I watched him turn and walk toward the door, I knew that I had made the right choice. This was the beginning of something new. Something just for me. The days that followed were a blur of cold calculations and quiet determination. I had done it. I had taken the step that I never thought I would. And yet here I was, standing on the other side of it all. Mark didn't speak much after that day. His attempts at reasoning, his apologies, his promises to fix things all fell on deaf ears. I wasn't listening anymore. The life we had built together, what I had given up, what I had sacrificed, wasn't enough to erase the betrayal, the lies that had come to light. I spent my days quietly taking action, shifting things around, making sure everything was in place before the final step. The kids were still in school, and I made sure that everything appeared normal, at least to them. They didn't need to know what had been happening behind the scenes. They didn't need to be dragged into this mess. But I could feel the weight of the decisions I had made bearing down on me, and the reality of it all still hadn't fully hit. I wasn't just ending a marriage. I was ending a version of myself, the version that had put up with everything, the version that had allowed herself to be a doormat for far too long. And as the days passed, I began to realize that what I was doing wasn't just about Mark or Sarah or the house. It was about me. It was about my freedom. It was about reclaiming the power I had lost along the way. Then one evening the doorbell rang again, pulling me from my thoughts. I wasn't expecting anyone. But I knew who it was before I even looked through the peephole. Mark. He stood there, holding a small bag in his hand, his face pale, his eyes tired. It had only been a few days, but I could see the toll this was taking on him. We need to talk, he said, his voice quiet, almost desperate. I didn't say anything at first. I just stared at him, taking in his defeated posture, the way his shoulders slumped, as if he knew this was the end. I know what you're trying to do, he continued, stepping closer. You're trying to take everything away from me. But you don't have to do this. We can fix this. We can go to therapy, we can work through it. We've been through worse, remember? His words were just noise now, empty promises. I had heard it all before. I had waited for change, for the things he promised to be better, but nothing ever changed. The realization hit me hard, and for the first time in a long while I felt calm. He wasn't going to manipulate me anymore. He wasn't going to make me feel guilty for wanting something more than this broken marriage. Mark, we're done, I said, my voice steady, unwavering. He looked at me, his eyes searching mine for any sign of weakness, but I didn't flinch. I've made my decision. There's no going back. You made your choices and now I'm making mine. This isn't about fixing anything anymore. He opened his mouth to speak, but I cut him off. I've already made arrangements. It's over. He stood there for a long moment, looking at me as if he couldn't comprehend what was happening. Finally, he lowered his head, his shoulders shaking with what I assumed was a mix of anger and frustration. He turned and walked away, his footsteps heavy on the porch. I closed the door behind him, feeling a strange mixture of relief and finality. It was over. And as I stood there, listening to the sound of his retreating footsteps, I realized something. I wasn't afraid anymore. I had taken back control of my life. It was my turn to start over, to build something new. And for the first time in a long time I felt free. The next few weeks passed in a blur, but not one of sorrow or regret. No, instead it was filled with an overwhelming sense of clarity. I had done it. I had taken the leap, faced the truth, and turned my life around. Every morning when I woke up, it felt like I was stepping into a new chapter. It wasn't easy. There were moments of doubt, moments when the weight of everything hit me harder than I had expected. But each day I grew stronger. Mark had tried to reach out a few times, sending texts and even calling. But I ignored them all. There was nothing left to say. He had made his bed, and now he had to lie in it. I wasn't his wife anymore. I wasn't his partner. I was me. And that was enough. It wasn't just about moving on from him, though. I realized there was so much I had forgotten about myself during all those years of sacrifice and silence. I had been so focused on making the marriage work, on keeping everything together, that I had lost sight of who I really was. But now I was rediscovering myself. I was enjoying the freedom that came with making my own decisions, living on my own terms. I was no longer hiding my true feelings, no longer pretending to be someone I wasn't. One afternoon, as I was picking up groceries, I ran into an old friend from work. We hadn't spoken in years, but the moment she saw me, her face lit up. "Jane, wow, you look amazing. What have you been up to?" she asked, her voice full of excitement. I smiled genuinely this time and felt a warmth in my chest. "I've been doing well. Just taking life one day at a time," I said, and it felt true. It felt real. We chatted for a few more minutes before I grabbed the last of what I needed and said goodbye. But as I walked back to my car, something shifted. I felt stronger than I ever had before. I was proud of myself. I wasn't the woman I had been when I walked out of that house. No, I was someone new. Someone who had fought for herself. Someone who had found the courage to walk away from a life that no longer served her. A few days later, I sat down at the kitchen table, the same place where everything had begun. This time, though, it was different. The papers Mark had signed, the documents that had once bound us together, were no longer relevant. I looked at them, not with anger or regret, but with a sense of finality. I had closed that chapter and I was ready to move forward. My phone buzzed, pulling me from my thoughts. It was a message from my lawyer, confirming that everything had gone through with the settlement. "It's all done. You're free," he wrote. I smiled, the weight lifting off my shoulders. I was free. That evening, after the kids had gone to bed, I sat outside in the backyard, feeling the cool breeze on my skin. The house was quiet, peaceful even, and I could finally breathe. Mark had tried to break me, but I had risen from the ashes. I wasn't a victim. I wasn't a passive bystander in my own life. I was the one in control now. I had taken back everything I had lost and I had gained so much more. It was time to embrace the life I had ahead of me. The life I had always deserved. And I knew deep down that it was going to be a beautiful one. Weeks passed and slowly the house began to feel like home again. I had made the changes both to my life and to the space around me. The walls that once felt like they were closing in on me now felt expansive, as if they were welcoming the new version of myself that was emerging. I could finally breathe, and with each passing day I could feel myself becoming more comfortable with who I was, where I was, and where I was headed. The kids had adjusted, too. I had been worried about how they would handle the changes, but they were resilient, and with me guiding them they were thriving. It wasn't easy, of course. There were moments when they would ask questions that I didn't have answers to. But I made sure to provide them with honesty, love, and reassurance. Life was moving forward, not perfectly but better. One afternoon, I was sitting in the living room, sipping my coffee and scrolling through emails, when I received a call from an unknown number. I hesitated for a moment before answering. "Hello, Jane." The voice on the other end was familiar, and it sent a shiver down my spine. It was Mark. "I need to talk to you," he said, his voice softer than I had ever heard it. "I'm not sure what you want me to say, Mark," I replied, trying to keep my tone neutral. "I don't think there's anything left to talk about." He paused, and I could almost hear the weight of his silence. "Please just hear me out. I know I messed up, I know I hurt you, but I need you to understand something. I understand everything I need to, Mark, I said. You chose Sarah. You made your decisions and I made mine. He sighed, and for a brief moment, I almost felt a pang of sympathy, but I quickly shut it down. I'm sorry, he said, his voice cracking. I'm so sorry for what I did. I stayed silent for a moment, weighing his words, trying to decide whether I should say something or just end the call. Mark, I'm not that person anymore, I finally said. I've moved on. I've learned to live for myself, not for you. And I'm not going back to the life I had with you. It's over. I know, he replied quietly. But I still love you, Jane. I know it doesn't fix anything, but I needed you to know that. I felt the weight of his words, but they no longer held the power they once had. You had your chance, Mark. You had many chances, I said, my voice steady, calm. But I'm not the woman who waits around for someone to change anymore. I'm the woman who chooses herself. I could hear him swallow, his breathing a little shaky now. I understand, he said. I just wanted you to know that I regret everything. I know, I repeated. But regret doesn't change anything. There was a long pause before I heard him speak again, but this time, his voice was almost resigned. I'll always love you, Jane, he said softly. Goodbye. Goodbye, Mark, I replied, and I ended the call. I sat there for a moment, my phone still in my hand, and I let the silence fill the room. For a brief second I felt a sense of closure, but then I realized I didn't need his love anymore. I had found a new love, the love for myself. And that was the one that mattered most. I wasn't waiting for anyone anymore. I was finally free. Free from the pain, free from the past, free from him. I took a deep breath and set my phone down on the table. I felt lighter, as if a weight had been lifted off my chest. Life was mine to live now, and I was going to make the most of it. I wasn't looking back. I was looking forward, toward the future I was building. One that was full of possibilities and hope. And I knew that whatever came next, I was ready for it. Months passed and life continued on, slowly but surely, changing in ways I hadn't imagined before. I was getting used to my new normal, and while there were moments of doubt, there were so many more moments of strength. It was like I was finally living the life I had always wanted to live, but never had the courage to pursue until now. The house felt different too. Not just physically but in every way. I had turned it into a sanctuary, a space that was all mine. There were no reminders of what had been, just quiet. Corners and peaceful spaces where I could sit with myself and breathe without fear. The kids were doing well. I made sure to keep the routine as normal as possible for them. I could see the changes in them too, but they seemed stronger, more resilient, just like me. I smiled more now, laughed more, and truly enjoyed the moments we shared. One afternoon, as I was walking home from picking the kids up from school, I was struck by how peaceful everything was. The sun was setting, casting a warm glow over the neighborhood, and the trees were swaying gently in the breeze. It was one of those moments when the world feels right, when you know that everything is exactly where it should be. But just as I thought that, my phone buzzed in my pocket. I pulled it out and I saw a message from my lawyer. It's final. Everything is done. I stood there for a moment, processing the words, letting them sink in. It was over. The divorce had been finalized. The last tie that bound me to Mark was now completely severed. There was no more paperwork to sign, no more meetings to attend, no more waiting for something to change. It was done. I could feel the weight of it lift off my chest, but at the same time there was a sense of finality that was hard to ignore. I looked down at the kids, who were now a few steps ahead of me, chatting about their day, completely unaware of what had just happened. They were happy, and that, more than anything, was what mattered. As I walked the last few blocks to our house, I reflected on how far I had come. Just a few months ago I had been lost, broken, unsure of who I was or what my future held. But now I knew. My future was mine to shape. I was in control of my own destiny. I had found my strength, my voice, and my peace. I had found myself again. That night, after the kids had gone to bed, I sat in the living room, looking out the window at the darkened sky. I could hear the faint hum of the streetlights outside, the soft whisper of the wind, and the quiet that had become so familiar to me. It felt like the calm after the storm, but there was no more storm to come. There was only peace now. I felt content, not because everything was perfect, but because I had made it through. I had walked through the fire and come out on the other side stronger, wiser, and more certain of who I was than I had ever been. I wasn't afraid anymore. I wasn't waiting for someone else to make me whole. I had already done that. And as I sat there in the silence, I knew that this was just the beginning. There was a whole world out there waiting for me, and I was ready to embrace it. The life I had always dreamed of was no longer a distant fantasy. It was real. It was mine.